Okay, there we are. British Mysteries 101. I had to do this without Kendall, so this is my own version of getting the slides organized, people. So hopefully I've got this working. But here we are, British Mysteries 101. Our detectives are Holmes, Poirot, and Dobbs, with the authors Arthur Conan Doyle, Agatha Christie, and Jacqueline Winspear. And, well, Doc does some introductions. There's some pictures of the authors and their detectives. So take it away, Doc.
All righty. So I'm a mystery junkie, and especially British mysteries. I stream them with reckless abandon on Acorn and BritBox, and really a week wouldn't be a week without a healthy dose of Hercule Poirot and Father Brown and the folks in Midsummer Murders. Although I have to say that it's remarkable how a county that small can have as many murders over a short period of time. I wanted to mention a very good book in case, and actually TV series. Lucy Worsley wrote a book called The English Art of Murder, and it was televised as a PBS series called A Very British Murder. So I highly recommend that. And she also did some she did an Agatha Christie series and many others. She's very, very good, although she really gets on my nerves because of the number. Jenny mentioned this, the number of costume changes she has in a given show. And she also acts as though she was the person who originally found out these obscure facts, when in fact she didn't. But the book is great. I read it cover to cover. So let's start with some fun facts and background. 1 out of every 3 books published today concerns crime. And the origins of mystery literature go way back. I mean, think of Oedipus Rex, think of Hamlet. But crime literature and nonfiction began to take hold in England in the 18th century. Daniel Defoe, Moll Flanders, was in prison for several years, so he had a lot of good background. Henry Fielding, who acted as a rural magistrate and satirized his fellow magistrates in Tom Jones and Joseph Andrews, and he wrote Jonathan Wild, which is a fictionalized account of one of the era's most notorious criminals. During the 18th century, John Gay wrote The Beggar's Opera, which Brecht in the 20th century transformed into the Threepenny Opera. And Ginny, did you act for me in the...
I believe, yes, I was in the Threepenny Opera. That's where you gave me the great direction. I was a beggar in that, and you told me I was the sweat on the hair of the armpit of the world. That was your directorial thing to me for what my character motivation was when I was in Threepenny Opera.
Thank you. It was a delight. I might also add that Robin Graham, who many of you know, I cast as a prostitute, much to the displeasure of her mother.
I think everybody in that play was either a prostitute or a beggar or a murderer. There weren't that many parts that you were saying, please let it be me. I went to be a beggar.
That's right, exactly. So anyway, the publications about true crime became increasingly popular with the appearance in 1728 of, and this is the title of it, The Accounts of the Lives, Crimes, and Confessions and Executions of Criminals. And in these supposedly true crime pieces, there was a lot of parting up of the facts. In 1773, the Newgate calendars, which purported to be more accurate and a bit more genteel than the previous accounts I mentioned, they were cheap to buy and they were exciting. But crime fiction really took hold in the 19th century. both in England and around the world. Poe was writing his stories. In the US, Dostoevsky was writing Crime and Punishment in Russia, and probably the most important crime stories in England were written by Wilkie Collins, who was a pal of Dickens, who authored The Moonstone and The Woman in White. And of course, there was Arthur Conan Doyle. Crime certainly didn't lose its popularity once the 19th century came about. In 1849, over 2.5 million people bought a rushed publication, ostensibly the authentic memoirs of Maria Manning, the Lady Macbeth of Bermondsey, who had helped kill her lover and bury him under her kitchen floor. Thousands attended her execution, including Dickens, who found it horrible, but not so horrible to refrain from using her as a model for his murderous Mademoiselle Hortense in Bleak House. So historians and literary critics point to urbanization, the rise of the middle class, the fear of crime, new types of poisons, and life insurance as catalysts for Robert Peel's establishment of the Metropolitan Police Force in 1829, Peelers. But Peelers were much more concerned with preventing crimes, not solving them. So in 1842, the Metropolitan created a detective branch whose fictional members include Gregson and Lestrade. And one last bon mot before Ginny takes over for a while. Dorothy Sayers of Lord Peter Wimsey fame said, "Death seems to provide the minds of the Anglo-Saxon race with a greater fund of innocent amusement than any other subject." Okay, Ginny, take it away.
Yep. Okay, so Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, he was born in Edinburgh in 1859. He was the second of 10 children. He spent 7 years in a Jesuit education. He studied medicine, surgery, and then he practiced in Southsea and Portsmouth. He was knighted for his field work in the Boer War, so he was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and he was married twice with 5 children. He wrote nearly 200 novels, short stories, poems, historical books, and pamphlets. He was very disappointed, of course, that Sherlock Holmes was what he was best known for. He really was hoping his historical novels, The White Company, Sir Nigel, and Brigadier Gerard, would be what people remembered him for. He was very disappointed about that in his life. He wrote 60 Sherlock Holmes stories. I have here my giant compendium of every Sherlock Holmes story ever written that I've had since junior high school with me, that has all the stories in it. And he wrote the stories were modeled on Dr. Joseph Bell, who was his professor in medical school, who studied his patients in minute detail and used diagnostic deduction to assess their care. And one of Bell's big quotes was, "No one should embrace theories that cannot be based on real material evidence." And so this thought is what got Conan Doyle, thinking about Sherlock Holmes. And his stories, by the way, were published in the Philadelphia Inquirer when they were being released in various publications around London. The Philadelphia Inquirer also published his serials, so you could see them right here in Philadelphia. Now, Conan Doyle was a big believer in paranormal experiences, spiritualism, and seances. He was actually friends with Houdini. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a difference. He wrote an article called An Evidence for Fairies. He believed in fairies. And when he died, a seance was held in Royal Albert Hall after his death. And the spiritualist medium, Estelle Roberts, said she actually spoke to him. And she actually has a book about her life. She was a big medium at the time. So what I have up here on the screen is an article from The Guardian that talked about him. And it says, Conan Doyle, a medical doctor and creator of the great rationalist Sherlock Holmes, might seem like an unlikely person to fall for the claims of mediums. But from the mid-19th century onwards, spiritualism had a widespread following, both in the UK and across the Atlantic. Its rise coincided with the Industrial Revolution and a period of great technological and scientific advances. Following the death of his son Kingsley, and that's the photo of his son there on the right, Kingsley, in World War I, Conan Doyle became a devout believer in life after death and an untiring missionary for the spiritualist cause, donating the equivalent of millions of pounds in today's money, trying to prove that the dead were all around us and eager for a chat. Houdini, the showman, longed to, let me just, there's Houdini on the right. Houdini, the showman, longed to believe that he might be able to communicate beyond the grave with his beloved mother, but knew far too much about trickery and faking of the stage to be easily convinced. Early in his career, before he found fame as an escape artist, Houdini and his wife Bess were not above drawing on their own theatrical skills to give public seances on the vaudeville circuit in order to ensure there was bread on the table. It was Houdini's public campaign to expose fraudulent mediums who he described as human leeches, particularly Margaret Crandon, a Boston medium who performed scantily clad and on the occasion apparently emitted ectoplasm from her vagina. It's a very strange thing for the 1800s. And that led to a rift between those two men, between Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. I mean, Conan Doyle and Houdini. They were very good friends. And the two men had not healed that rift or spoken when he died from a ruptured appendix in 1926 is when Houdini died, and they had stopped speaking to one another. So we're going to see evidence of his thoughts about spiritualism too as we move on here with the Study in Scarlet. So A Study in Scarlet was first published in Beeton's Christmas Annual in 1887. The picture there to the right is what the cover of Beeton's Christmas Annual looked like. And the story was amidst a million ads for everything under the sun that they sold in London at the time. And the story and the copyright for the story were bought by Beeton's for 25 pounds, about $4,000 today. So in the long run, he lost out, Doyle, on that because he sold the copyright to that. He had published 30 stories in 9 years before he wrote A Study in Scarlet. He was 27 years old. The original title was called A Tangled Skein, and the lead characters were Sheriford Holmes and Ormond Sacker. Now, somehow Watson came out a whole lot better than Ormond Sacker. I don't know what he was thinking with those names, but that's what he had at first. Doyle did also not expect the Holmes series to catch on. He wrote it as a one-off. He wrote the story for the money. He didn't think he was going to write another one. And so therefore, as you start to read through the whole compendium of Sherlock Holmes stories, you will find there are lots of continuity errors. A couple I can point out for you is that sometimes Holmes's bullet wound from the Boer War, sometimes it's in his shoulder, and sometimes it's in his leg. And they just go back and forth. When Watson gets married, he marries a woman who's an orphan, but then in the next book, she's going to visit her mother. And it didn't seem to bother Doyle that he wasn't keeping this straight. But the people who are like Sherlock Holmes, fanatics, the Baker Street Irregulars, and there's an Arthur Conan Doyle Society, they actually work on trying to tie all this together to make it make sense why he has done that. They also look at the books as that Sherlock Holmes was a real person and did exist, and Conan Doyle was just really the scribe. And so they actually put the book in what they call their chronological order, not the order in which they were written, but the order in which they were sort of interested about them. So spiritualism in A Study in Scarlet, and we're going to get to talking about that a little bit, but I'll just talk about that for a second. So he included a brief reference to spiritualism in the story when Jefferson Hope told Holmes that while driving to the place of execution, he saw the approving spirits of John and Lucy, and they were pleased their deaths would soon be avenged. Quote from the book, "I could see old John Ferrier and sweet Lucy looking at me out of the darkness and smiling at me just as plain as I see you in this room. All the way they were ahead of me, one on each side of the horse, until I pulled up to the house in Brixton Road." He added that when he walked the drunken Drebber to the vacant house, "I give you my word that all the way the father and daughter were walking in front of us." And so he sort of tied in some of his ideas about spiritualism as he did that. So let's jump back to some discussion, and then we'll go on to some talk about Mormonism probably.
Okay, let me begin by asking a question that sort of it relates to any book that I read and really like. But why do you think that the stories of Sherlock Holmes remain popular today? What is it about them? And once again, I hope that you all contribute. And in fact, Beth, I would like you after 20 minutes to tell me to shut up so some of you could ask your questions, okay? A simple shut up, Doc, will do. But I'd like to hear from the rest of you. Just at the beginning, like how has Doyle created, stories that we still love today? And my God, all of the movie versions, TV shows, and so forth. What is it about
Are
Sherlock Holmes?
microphones on?
Hmm?
Can you hear us?
I can.
Oh, I can tell you for me, it's very basic. It's his powers of observation and his deductions that he makes. To me, that's what everything else is worthwhile. And I don't think many of the group here, I don't know how many people are on, but I don't know if you guys remember the old Channel 48 years ago when they had the Basil Rathbone and Night.
Absolutely. I love the Basil Rathbone. He's
Yeah.
my favorite Sherlock.
To me,
Still my thing. Yeah.
that's Sherlock Holmes. And they did a great job. In this particular book, which I read years ago, the whole Mormon business was just like, I said to my wife, there's something wrong here. They must have combined these books by mistake.
know.
What's this guy in the UK talking about Utah, which I assume he had never been to in the 1880s? And I thought, this is ridiculous. So personally, that wasn't my favorite part of the story.
Yeah, and we'll get to that part of the book in a while. Because
How did you know I was in Afghanistan? I mean, that's it. I could hear that over and over and over.
oh yeah,
That's
and
true.
also when the fellow's out in the street who then delivers something to them, and he says, "Oh yeah, well he was in the Navy," and this, yeah, there's that perspicacity that's like, how
Do you
can
feel
you
the
do
same
that?
way? Or am I a minority, or does everyone love that aspect?
Oh, of course,
I was
love
going to
it.
say one of the interesting things when he talks about, Watson was injured in the Battle of Maiwand.
Yeah.
And for those of you who have been to Afghanistan or studied about the Battle of Maiwand, that was 2,500 British soldiers against 25,000 Afghanistans. And so they didn't come out very well in that battle.
No wonder he got hurt.
Exactly. No wonder he was shot with his Giselle rifle at the time.
He's lucky it wasn't his shoulder and his leg. It's not just one.
Some people say that's what happened. Went through his leg into his shoulder, for his shoulder into his leg.
It's like the Kennedy assassination.
Exactly. The magic bullet.
Oh my God.
So, Beth, what do you like Sherlock Holmes?
That's a tough question.
There you go.
It's so important to the genre, but I thought that the character of Sherlock Holmes was a little annoying.
Why?
A little pedantic, a little he's so interesting and knowledgeable, but almost to the point that he was not described in depth or realistic. And so it made me feel conflicted, but also want to see if this is something that continues in successive Sherlock Holmes novels, if I might appreciate him more, or if he's sort of a one-dimensional character throughout the series. I hate to say that, though.
I think as somebody who's reading through the whole series as part of this Rosenbach Museum course, you do learn more about him, and he gets a little more sympathetic. He's probably his most obnoxious in A Study in Scarlet, and he gets more human and nicer to people, and is a little more, he does develop as it goes on. I mean, he's still a know-it-all, but he gets more human as it goes on.
A lot of shortcomings. A lot of shortcomings.
One of the things that they did that I thought was kind of amusing in the beginning was when John Watson enumerates, this is what he knows everything about. And then this is what he knows literally nothing about, but it was just kind of artificial that none of the things he knew nothing about ended up having relevance to the story. Like he's somehow decided that this subset of things are irrelevant to life, which is not necessarily true. It just so happens that the stories revolve around things that he knows in depth. So it would be interesting to kind of see if he did end up, it'd be an interesting subversion to take the story and have knowledge of all these things that Sherlock has decided are completely unimportant be actually the crux to solving the crime, which would be kind of an interesting like future story. But I'm kind of with that he seemed kind of like a pompous jerk.
And for me,
As
I
the story-
think
okay.
as an argument to what Rachel and Beth think, I think that maybe I think what Watson does, because Watson seems like a down to earth guy. So if everybody thinks that on this Zoom call, then we can really relate, because if Watson's just a normal down to earth guy and he's not a pompous fool and whatever, but he admires him so much, I think that part of it is kind of the balancing act there. But to Doc, your original question for me, and I think Tom was on the same line, the aha moments for the reader, that's, I feel like, oh, that's right, oh, he did that, and you're kind of putting the pieces together as Sherlock Holmes is doing it. And I think that makes you kind of feel like the know-it-all too. Or if before the chapter, he's like, oh, it was this, it was this, it was this, and you're like, I thought of that. I think that's why the longevity with these books is really sustained, because those aha moments for people to always feel like they're right is going to be forever, right?
So, yeah, I mean, something that always frustrates me in mysteries is if I find at the end of how the hell was I supposed to be able to figure this out? Right? It's like, what? There is no way. How do you feel about that with Sherlock Holmes? I mean, do you feel like, okay, we're getting like, for example, what if the story, greatly reduced, of the Mormons occurred earlier?
I think it
But
was.
I think that Study in Scarlet is the least Sherlock Holmes book of them all. I mean, that was the first one. I don't think he intended to make a series of clever mystery stories. I think the fact that he got into short stories and made them also clever, and also, which is what the popularity was. I think A Study in Scarlet is just a novel that kind of introduces this character that he probably wasn't going to use too much again. But once he started getting these clever stories, and that could be read in one sitting, basically, from a through the magazine that came out monthly, everybody enjoyed them a lot more about the little plots and the little answers, and then you could, you were done. You didn't have a 2 or 3 day, 4 day novel that you had to get through. It was one, and I think that's why Sherlock Holmes was popular. I don't think A Study in Scarlet was really why it was. I think it was the short stories.
He only wrote 4 novels, right? The rest were short stories. Out of the basket, at the biggie.
But it did sell out. Study in Scarlet sold out its printing. I mean, it was very popular at the time.
I think it was after Hound
Just
of
the more you read Holmes, the more you read Doyle, the more you get excited about the different stories. And as you say, they're short and they're easy to read in a single sitting. But it did sell out and was very popular at the time.
I would like to jump in, if that's okay. It's kind of like the formula with the Home and Garden TV, where after half an hour, you get this great reveal. So it's a short amount of time of a commitment with, and it hooks you right away so that you're invested in not just figuring it out, but waiting when you can't figure it out for someone to show you.
Excellent. Yeah.
I think there's also something to how Derek was saying, how relatable Watson seems, and everything's written through his perspective through the entire first part. So you're kind of getting to know Sherlock yourself too, as Watson gets to know him, and then you get this background about the Mormons. Like, okay, maybe his skills are very impressive. Maybe he does know what he's talking about.
Like your style on hat, Sean, too, by the way. Thank you.
And to kind of go off of what Becky was saying too, and also to tie back to what Doc was saying about like the grippingness of the story and what if the Mormon bit happened in the beginning. I think that's like the form kind of dictating content here, where it's like it was written to be super gripping in the beginning and there's this murder and automatically you want to pay attention. But like the payoff of that, like I feel like there might have been some greater cathartic payoff if the Mormon story had been earlier on versus just like this separate bit. Because by the time it's like, oh, and he's the murderer, we already knew he was the murderer, and I didn't really care about the guys who were dead anyways because they were dead on arrival for me, because that's how it's started. So I don't know. That was interesting structure.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's it's a pretty flawed book. Because of its structure. But did anybody think, I mean, I don't know what it is about me, but I'm always looking for, whenever I'm reading, so I don't care whether it's the 19th century or 20th century, but I'm always looking for relevance. And the one thing that I found in this story was so much relevance to our world, which makes me think that that's another reason why, his works are sustained. I mean, think about it. We're the Mormons. Well, they're the other. They're the other. How do we think about the other today? It just seems to me that the behavior, who commits crimes? Well, people from other countries, not British people. I mean, it's the other people. They do it, right?
You comparing them to immigrants?
Hmm?
You mean like immigrants?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm a little thick. I'm just trying to. I haven't been in school for a long time.
You're not thick at all. You're not thick. I'm
Relation?
probably inarticulate, so that's we make a good pair.
Yeah.
Did anyone feel that way? Or I mean, it's curious whether I was like saying, yes, okay, this is today. Yes, this is today.
Well, I think one of the things I certainly, and maybe because I was doing more research on it, but the idea of the conspiracy theories that were being thrown into it. And today, with all the different conspiracy theories that are still happening, the Inquirer had a great article about that in the Sunday's paper about all the conspiracy theories. But right away, that whole murder was tied up in somebody trying to throw it towards these different, conspiracy theories that were prevalent at that time, but we still have existing today. So I saw that as something.
I think that's, I mean, that's dead on. I'm thinking, my God, who knew that Taylor Swift was working for the Pentagon? Who knew?
I think, if I may,
of course.
I've also been, Virginia, I've also been following the Rosenbach series, and very much enjoyed last night's conversation about the adventure of the yellow face.
Yes,
because you see the progression and the maturation of all the characters from studying Scarlet all the way up to now, where and I think it gets right back to the point about it's sort of the we're talking about 1890s London, where there are the others, there are the Mormons, there are the Indians, there's Tonga, from which he's a little crazy blow dart shooting murderous pygmy who's in The Sign of the Four, which is the second novel. I mean, there are these other other than English villains that appear all throughout most of the stories, but there's also an awful lot of British villains and thieves and murderers too. I think most of the majority of the criminals that Holmes chases throughout the whole canon are British. But there is this, kind of in the context of London in 1890, the audience that Holmes is writing the stories for are, the British sort of middle class who can afford to buy the Strand magazine every month. And to them, there's the Empire, there's Britain, there's the sun never sets in the British Empire, and then there are the other sort of nefarious people that are in the world, that are invading into the British middle class. So Doyle was a really, really brilliant writer, and the way that just the structure of the Study in Scarlet, yeah, the Jefferson Hope, who's the individual who is the murderer. We kind of get the sense in the first part of the story that he's a murderer. He's kind of crazy. He chased these two Mormon villains all the way around the world for 20 years before he finally caught up to them and killed them. So we know he's a murderer, but what was his motivation? And you sort of get that through his explanation in the second half of the book, and he becomes a more sympathetic figure, and even the way he dies. I mean, he dies from after he's unloaded his sins. He's confessed. He's confessed to Holmes and to Watson, and he got his revenge on the two men who killed his beloved and his future father-in-law. These two villainous Mormon characters who ruined this guy's life. He chased them down. He got his revenge. He confessed his sins, and at the very end, he died. His first night in prison, he dies of a ruptured aneurysm. And the description of his face at the end was sort of this beatific kind of calm, serene expression on his face. So he and I think, I don't know if that was Doyle's intent or not, but I think it has to be. I mean, he starts off as this murderous, crazy man, and at the very end, you sort of see your opinion of him has changed as a reader, and I think that was a brilliance of Arthur Conan Doyle.
And on the coattails of what Jerry's saying, I thought so much that Holmes sympathized with Jefferson Hope that if Holmes had the ring, he was going to give him the ring, his beloved ring's back. Like, that's what, to me, I was like, this is definitely the next paragraph. That Holmes is going to be like, you know what? Here's her ring. Yeah. Take it to prison with you, wear it as you die, whatever. Like, to that point, to Jerry's point, I thought it was going to go that far.
To piggyback on Jerry's comment as well, this is not the only time in the book where they subvert your expectations of the morality of a character. They actually did it with the Mormons too. They saved Ferrier and his daughter. They gave them the ability to have prosperous, good life for a long time. And then obviously two of them snatched it away from them in the worst way possible. And it leads to that sort of otherization that you were talking about, Doc, throughout the rest of the book. And so they just did it in the other direction when it came to Hope.
Very good. You got a table slap, by the way, Beth.
I would call it also, Beth, predatory recruitment, I think, by the Mormons. I think they were rather destitute on the wagon trail. And I don't know, they had too much of a choice. And then they were like, well, you're going to believe in our God and our ways, or we'll just leave you here to die otherwise. So I'm not quite sure it was all that altruistic, if that's the right word,
I really liked this story. I liked how there was no question, like everything was finished, nothing left me guessing, which I really appreciated. And the whole spiritual aspect of the author was interesting to learn today, because when he's talking about how Sherlock Holmes only had stuff in his mind that, would help him in his interests and jobs. That was so fascinating to me, because I'm kind of the opposite mind. Like, I think the more you know, then the more you know, and the better you can be at everything and anything. So that was interesting. And him being such a skilled detective and being able to solve all these crimes, but then he has this mindset where he can only know certain things. That was interesting. And one of the things that he didn't know was about this guy, Thomas Carlyle, who I've heard of, but I didn't know who it was, so I looked it up.
Dickens. He wrote from Tale of Two Cities. Carlyle wrote the history of the French Revolution.
Okay,
well,
Yeah.
yeah, so that's what Dickens based, you know.
Well, so I looked him up, and he was like, he was also into religion. He believed that religion required a new form where the essential truths, once revolutionary but grown ossified, were again made new. And another thing about his quote, one of the quotes that came up was, "He who has health has hope. He who has hope has everything. A man without a goal is like a ship without a rudder." So, and then Sherlock Holmes, like, kind of, just looks at what's there and solves the case. He doesn't, like you were saying, like, make anything up, or it is what it is, and he just pulls the truth out of that. So that was kind of an interesting little, like, the one thing that he mentions that he didn't know was this guy. And then in 1875, the Theosophical Society started, which was like, very spiritual and esoteric and abstract, kind of in that realm. And then to have the author be interested in mediums, and then to include the Mormons, which were very, different in their way of life. And I feel like a lot of people, did kind of demonize them for their lifestyle, to have these two guys that end up being, these horrible guys, but they were part of the Mormon society. And then the ring, I thought that was so interesting. It was such a key feature in the story, because it was one of the things that threw the initial detectives off, those two dopey guys. And then I think it was good that the story about the Mormons wasn't until the end, because you would have known, like, no, there was no girl part of the murder aspect, but the girl did have a role. And then when Sherlock first gets to the scene and he's looking on the ground, that kind of, like, does give you a little clue that, what is he looking for in the ground? And I was thinking footprints, but then also all the footprints of the police there, but he was actually looking at the tread marks from the cat. It was just such a good story.
Very good. Well,
and Lee said it a couple times too. I think it's no accident that his name is Jefferson Hope.
Yeah.
I feel like the Hope part, his last name, the Ferriers definitely were like, we need something to believe in. And the dad's watching the days tick away. And, he's like, where is the hope coming from? And his name is Jefferson Hope. I thought that was no accident.
Early in the 18th century, the 19th century, before the creation of the police force, before the proliferation of stories and with villains, the criminals were kind of idealized. I mean, like the highwaymen, the attractive highwayman, or the murderer who gains our sympathy through his confession upon his execution. I mean, so the idea of the murderer being, like, not such a bad guy, or even having a real moral compass is very Victorian. Really from the beginning of the century.
It's interesting to think of this too in terms of the Jack the Ripper story, which had happened like just before this, right? And maybe there's something to the fact that he chose an American villains to sort of draw it away from the Jack the Ripper, but it seems like there was a fascination with murder at the time.
Oh my God, it was so popular. I mean, like, it was it's like, why do so many of us gravitate towards murder stories? I mean, it's what Dorothy Sayers says. There's this innocent attraction. You wonder how innocent it is.
I think
do you want to just take a second and look at some of the Mormonism, and then we can go back to?
I think that'd be an excellent idea.
Double signature. Where's my?
Wait a minute, but Sarah had something to say. How are you doing, Sarah?
Go ahead, Sarah, jump in there. I'll bring up my slides again.
I was thinking about that and how, you were talking about the rise of the middle class and how it seems like people who are in the middle class like horror stories and things like that, or people who are in relative safety like horror stories because they get to kind of live scary things and then step out of them again. I thought that was one of the reasons why maybe they're still so popular. And also just because I think in troubling times, which I guess we're always in troubling times, but people like to find somebody who's a real person who can somehow pull everything together and just make it come together neatly. And I think there's like a definite attraction to that just will never go away. At least for me, I like puzzles to be solved very neatly. So
really good.
Yeah.
Okay,
So,
Jenny, go to
a little bit about where did this Mormonism come from? In Great Britain, what was the sudden interest? So missionaries from America, from Utah, started coming to Great Britain in the 1830s, and they were converting. For those of you who've seen Book of Mormon, hello, my name is Elder Price, and I would like to talk to you about the most amazing book. Okay, well, they turned up in Great Britain and were spreading their story, and the British, it was very appealing to them, a lot of the aspects of Mormonism. But of course, what they downplayed when they came to Great Britain is nobody talked about polygamy being a part of it. So people were thinking that, they liked the ideas, they liked the concepts. And it really started to reach its peak around the 1850s with a lot of people, following Mormonism, and it was very prevalent. However, Doyle also was using Mormonism to criticize the Catholic Church. So he had written a book, a story called The Narrative of John Smith, which was a criticism of Joseph Smith. And what happened was he viewed Mormonism through the lens of the Catholic Church. His Catholic upbringing, he was Catholic. He then dropped the Catholic faith entirely. He got involved in spiritualism, changed his whole religion. And he sort of really was against the Catholic Church. And so as he looked at that, he emphasized the priesthood, institutional violence in the church, the place of women, that had counterparts in his former church. In 1886, it was much easier for Doyle to cast Brigham Young as, and by the way, he's the only historical figure to ever appear in a Sherlock Holmes story, Brigham Young, that as a villain than it would have been to have the Pope or somebody from the Catholic Church be a villain. It was a lot easier to pick on Mormons because people were willing to do that. And as the story went on with this, there's a lot of things with the Holy Four, Kimball and Johnson, that were with Drubber and Strangerson. They were real people as well. Kimball and Johnson were real Mormons, and they were Masons in real life. If you remember the Ring of the Masons was there when they discovered things. Kimball and Johnson were both Masons, and there's a lot of use in the book, if you followed it, of the number 4. There was the Holy Four. Ferrier was rescued on May 4th. Ferrier was murdered on August 4th, and Enoch and Drubber were murdered on March 4th. And there were a lot of secret societies like the Danites that they talked about. There was of course, the Illuminati, the Inquisition, the Femgericht in Germany, the Carbonari. There were a lot of secret societies that time in Europe. So that was also something people knew a lot about. And here's some other interesting things. I just sort of jumped to this other thing. For those of you who are interested, here's some more things you can look at. Oh, sorry. What's that doing? Come on, get off my screen. I don't know what that's doing. I guess it'll go away. For more information on that, but let me just go back
Right
to
click.
Right click. Thank you. No, it just keeps jumping around. Oh, there it goes. Okay. Some real life interesting things about the story. So he did get a lot of this information from things that were going on in real life. There was a guy who wrote, Jules Remy, did travels in Utah, and he borrowed some information from him about where he got the Baker Street Irregulars. But in 1857, Hector McLean murdered the Mormon apostle Parley Pratt. The slaying of the Utah Senator Mitt Romney's great-great-grandfather was Parley Pratt, and it was largely thought to have contributed to the Mountain Meadows Massacre in Utah, where about 120 traveling Arkansans were shot down by a Mormon militia in September. Some of the men who helped Hector McLean track down and kill Parley Pratt north of Van Buren in May of 1857 were said to have been part of a group of Arkansans moving west, adding to the violent response. Like the whole idea of these posses of violent people killing people were, pulled in there. And these were real stories that they were getting at the time from people traveling in Utah and things happening in the United States. So this was all like 30 years before. But one of the interesting things I just want to share, the last part of this, was a woman named Fanny Stenhouse who had got taken in by the Mormons. And here's a quote from her after they realized there was a long story I won't go into, but about a guy who was a Mormon who was married, who had a 19-year-old girl who was living with them, who started out as a friend, but turned out to be much more than a friend. And that's sort of what led to people realizing polygamy was happening. But Fanny Stenhouse said, I began to realize that the men to whom I had listened to with such profound respect and had regarded as the representatives of God had been guilty of the most deliberate and unblushing falsehood. And I began to ask myself whether, if they could do this in order to carry out their purpose in one particular, they might not be guilty of deception upon other points. Who could I trust now? For 10 years, the Mormon prophets and apostles had been living in polygamy at home, while abroad they vehemently denied it and spoke of it as a deadly sin. This was a painful awakening to me. We had all of us been betrayed. And so this was, a real life thing that happened in Britain. And after this incident happened, when the polygamy came out, that's when it basically started to fade, and people in England were really done with the whole Mormon movement. So Holmes did pick up some of his stuff. And I guess the one other thing I would mention about if I have my little sheet here, about the Baker Street Irregulars from his travels, his little band of helpers, was from this Jules Remy Travels. He said, when he was over there, there were a group of kids. He said, all governments which find the maintenance of a police force too costly to commit its functions to the should commit its functions to the impudence of young street scamps. They will be sure to find them very zealous, if not very clear-headed agents. And he had mentioned that, and sort of Holmes, Doyle, the idea for his Baker Street Irregulars helping out. So a lot of this book was based on things going on at the time, or previous to that. So anyway, that's some more scoop on why Mormons in this story. There was a lot going on in Great Britain with the Mormons. So I'll drop the sharing there and we go back.
So my question then is, a lot of us, clearly are looking at that, at the almost separate story, but related, of the Mormons. But I wonder why it is, and I've been reading about this, why he would choose them, because they are the other big time, to focus on, to be, really a very substantial portion of the book. Like what, and I'm talking more like sort of from Doyle's point of view. Like, first of all, we know that he wanted to make money from the book. We know that. And unfortunately, he really didn't, because he sold the rights for 25 pounds. But, think about this, what particular about the Mormons would attract his primary audience, more or less middle-class Britons, rather than either another group or British folks themselves. What is he gaining by and Utah? Why Utah? Why does he go to the American West?
I'll throw out
because it's interesting.
Yeah, it's exotic.
Fascinating. It was at the exotic place to the British middle class. They knew nothing about it,
and he could get away with saying whatever he wanted about him. He could,
without knowing a damn thing. But he did know. He did. There's a lot of accuracy in the in his discussion of Mormonism, but there is certainly an exotic element to that. And that's going to appeal. It's the same kind of like, okay, well, they were polygamists.
Yeah, that's the first thing that anybody, in Britain in the 1890s or in the United States in the 1980s, the first thing they'll think of if you mention Mormon is that, gee, they can have more than one wife. And that's basically not too many people are going to go beyond that and try to understand what it's all
Well,
about.
the cool thing is that, it was to Victorians and, really awful that people would do that, but it was also really fascinating. Like, whoa.
Plus, it had been in the newspapers in Great Britain because of these events that had happened.
Yes, yeah.
It was being covered there. People knew about Mormonism. And, because Britain, the sun never sets on the British Empire, but they weren't any longer in the United States. There were people making travels over there, just like Dickens went around the United States. This Jules Remy was traveling in Utah. And so bringing back stories of a strange place, but it also gave, Doyle that foil of being able to talk about the things he didn't like, patriarchal societies. He didn't like women being subjugated, and he felt he really wanted to show how, sort of evil or how people's ideas can turn. And I think all of that makes such a good story. Because as I forget who mentioned it, whether it was Beth or Lee or whatever, said about, you start out with like, they rescue them in the desert. And even though they, obviously told them, come with us and believe in us or we'll dump you. They still brought them, out of the desert and to their home. And so you thought, okay, well, and they were having a prosperous, pretty nice life till Lucy came of age. And then suddenly, everything turned and got ugly. And that makes a great story. I mean, here we are having this thing. I'm making money. I'm prosperous. Ferrier didn't get married and they didn't really lean on him too much about that, even though, it's strange to be a Mormon and not be married even once, let alone, to be a widow like he was. That just was unheard of. So it brought all those exotic elements into the tale, which I thought made it that much more interesting. And plus it was sort of like, it was totally a two-part story. Like you have this Watson narrated story, and then suddenly you're in a third party story of life in America.
Right. And I think that whole aspect of the polygamy is what makes Mormonism so like wild or like exotic, like you keep saying, but also cringy, but more like dangerous. Like you have to marry 17 wives because we are, and we don't want to be weird. Like everyone has to do it so that it's what we do. Like if you don't, then
something's wrong with you.
Yeah, and the more wives I have makes me more admirable. And that's what one of their they go to the house and they're like, I've got more wives than he does, so that makes me that much more of a man, or whatever it was that they were trying to sell.
And it seems like, given like it sounds like the cultural zeitgeist in London at that time is Mormons were already kind of villain coded. And it's interesting because I was thinking I've heard the word villain several times in this conversation, and not once has it referred to the murderer. It has only referred to the victim. And just listening to this conversation was kind of striking. And the second Watson sees the body, he knows he hates this guy. Like he describes him in these horrible terms of hideous face. He walks in is like, I hate this dude. He's dead, but I hate him. And then you kind of go, and then if you've got a group of people that are already in the newspapers for being villains, you've already started your story that, hey, these guys suck. And then, when the resolution happens, the murderer is almost the hero in a sense, because you've already conveniently been able to describe the victim as this person that we already are kind of primed to dislike from the very beginning of the story through the break in Utah to the very end.
Yeah, Rachel, that's interesting. Like I have a question about that is like that, and what you say, Doc, with like how does this relate or resonate? What did you say? Like
I can't remember anything.
As regular people here in the world, like we really don't have control over justice, right? Like we rely on the government and police and whoever has power, but we can't like take justice the way that we want it in our own hands. So we love to read about people getting justice, it might not be like okay with us or legal or whatever, but it's appealing and we love it. I do.
It's like the Equalizer on television. You know, if you watch the Equalizer or any of the Equalizer movies, people root for somebody who's getting justice that we can't get for ourselves.
Well, what about Dexter? Dexter, right, Ginny? I mean, Dexter.
Dexter too, exactly.
Right.
You know, he's only killing bad people, so how bad can you feel about it?
Yeah,
Same with a comic book
Batman's
character, the
same thing.
Punisher is the same exact thing.
Yeah, I thought one of probably the most interesting aspect to Jefferson Hope was the method of murder. He had these two pills. One of them was poison and one of them was not. And he gave that option of which pill to choose to Drebber. He said, you need to choose one of these. And if God truly, is on my side, then, you'll choose the one that I want you to choose. And he chooses the poison one, which I mean, for a guy who's so obsessed with finding these guys, he follows them all over the world for 20 years. He gets arrested. He gets, he's completely destitute. He's got nothing left. And to finally catch the guy that he's chased across the entire globe. And then he presents him with this choice and says, all right, I'm going to leave it up to God, whether you live or die. I'm not going to kill you. It's going to be God's choice, whether you die. That to me, it's just, it makes him such an incredibly complex and complicated character. He goes back and he tries to do the other thing with Stangerson. He tried to use the pills, but then Stangerson, said, I'm not going to, I'm going to kill you first. And he winds up having to he winds up having to stab Stangerson just in self-defense. But I think he's such, just like almost all of Doyle's characters. And the deeper you get into the canon, you find this each hero and heroine. The very first, what somebody else had said before, like, when things are spinning wildly out of control and they're chaotic, you want somebody to come and bring it all together and make it make sense. If all Holmes ever did was just make things make sense, he'd be kind of a one-dimensional, boring character. But he's not. And Doyle, the very first short story that's written, the Scandal in Bohemia, Holmes is wrong. He gets beaten by a woman, by Irene Adler, which is crazy because they published the two novels, and in the very first short story that appeared in the Strand, Holmes gets absolutely outsmarted and outwit by a woman. So it just makes Holmes a much more human character, a much more interesting character. And Jefferson Hope, again, I think that one aspect of his personality and his decision making made him, to me, just such an interesting character. So,
I didn't pick up on this in the book, and this is a question for everybody, if somebody can tell me, but not in the book. I didn't pick up on it, but in a study question after the fact, it said that Drebber and Stangerson had become Christian and had dumped Mormonism by the time they got to London. Now, I never got that in the book, but I think that that's somewhere, either I missed it and didn't hear it, or, didn't read it and pick up on it. But I wonder what that has to do with anything, because then it's like, well, he's not really villainizing Mormons at all anyway, because he said by the time that they were killed, they were Christians.
Well, they left Brigham Young's group and separated with them and started their own sect. And then when they, moved away from them because they just wanted to do it differently than Brigham Young. So, I mean, and Mormons are Christians. I mean, they believe in Christian things with their own interpretation of a lot of it, but they moved away and started their own sect. So then when he was chasing them and they were discovered, then they just kept on the move. But they did split with Brigham Young, which a lot of, Mormon sects did split over, ideas and policies. And some people, just the violence of like the Danites that were, out there killing people, and the fact that they were raiding, wagon trains coming across to get the women and killing everybody else because they didn't have enough women for them to have multiple wives. A lot of people got turned off by that. I can't imagine why.
Well, there was, it was interesting because one of the accusations against the Mormons came from members of the upper middle and upper classes in England, because they saw the Mormons as white slavers, because they were taking away their maids. Their maids were becoming Mormons, And therefore, what are we to do? What are we to do? You know, it's the thing that I like about Doyle is, although I have to say, I think some of the dialogue in the Utah section is some of the worst I've ever read. I mean, at one time, because he's trying to be Western, right? And at one point, I remember he uses the word pard instead of partner. I had to put the book down at that point. Who says pard? Come on. But anyway, I think one of the interesting things is the kind of moral relativity of the book, because okay, so what we're saying is it's really probably a very good idea that Hope killed those two guys. They deserved it because they killed Farrier, right?
And Lucy.
And ultimately Lucy. So what we're saying is, well, yeah, I mean, murder, but it was, we're glad that he did that. We're glad those two guys got killed. At the beginning, we're wondering, like, well, who the hell are they? I mean, like, why should we care at all? But then what happens is all of a sudden, we don't care that they're dead and they've been murdered. We're happy. It's like, yes. And our murderer becomes the anti-hero, right? I mean, so that's a wonderful kind of moral relativism that he works with in the book, because and it's so real, because it's the way I think. I mean, in a way, a lot of us think. I mean, well, anyway, that it's just a point that seems to sort of circle around some of the stuff you've been saying recently.
Well, the Mormons weren't the only people on the planet that had a lot of wives. I mean, what makes Anna and the King of Siam such a successful play? I mean, the fact that he had 30 kids. It was wow. He had 30 kids. Or Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, they had harems. Of women. It wasn't the only society that had that, but to writers and to people who writing stories, it's interesting. It's something to
why choose
the
Mormons? Why not another group?
Yeah,
that had the same practices, right?
But I think it's interesting because it's Christians having a theory of multiple wives, whereas people in other those countries are not Christians. They're so already the British population would see them as pagans and not having the religion. Let's face it, England was all one Church of England for a long time, so they weren't accepting so much of other religions, and even Catholicism took a lot of criticism in Great Britain. So I just think it's interesting that they chose a Christian religion, and I think maybe just the whole fascination with it because something was going on at that time in England. I mean, that there have been things happening, but it's a good point, Robin, that there are a lot of other religions that have multiple wives, or other civilizations that believe in multiple wives.
By the way, I got so obsessed with that Mormon section that I said, I've got to learn more about the Mormons. So I'm talking to Kendall Manor and I Zoom every Friday. And so I said, Kendall, and he lives in Utah. So I said, Kendall, give me the name of a book that you would recommend so I'll learn more. And he said, I don't know of any because they're all written by Mormons. So I said, well, that's obviously no help to me at all. But then I started reading around and I found a book that I actually just lent to Ginny that's fascinating. I have to mention, it's called Under the Banner of Heaven. And it's by John Krakauer.
Awesome.
Incredible writer. And I think it's a fair, I mean, it focuses on the murder of, I mean, it really is true crime. It focuses on the murder of a young woman and her child, infant, I think, by two Mormons who were part of a splinter group and, had broken away from the main church. But it gives such fascinating insights, I think. And I don't think it's like, really one-sided. I think, because I think it's beautifully researched. So anyway, I'm throwing that out there in case any of you share that same kind of obsession. Because it's a really good book.
Well, I think the reason I was obsessed with Sherlock Holmes is, of course, I started Sherlock Holmes on Channel 48 also. We would watch, my friend Dave Brooks and I would be in his TV room watching Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, and we saw them all. And then I started reading the stories after I did that.
Okay.
And I got so upset at those movies then, especially the portrayal of Dr. Watson as a buffoon by Nigel Bruce. And I've gone to the point where I've read and watched just about every portrayal of, and I even got, my wife even bought me for Christmas a book that people would write new Sherlock Holmes stories, and one came out every month, and I would look forward to it come in the mail, and I'd read, and I've got a book full of those now. But it's just an interesting thing that my book that my mom got me in 1971 for Christmas when I was in college, is so worn that the cover is worn off. In fact, I had to take the cover off the one section, and it's just been a great. It's been so much fun to read, and I reread, and I still even watch the Jeremy Brett movies, on TV. So, and those are really, they're a lot more to the point for follow the story than the Basil Rathbones fighting the Nazis. And but it's been a great for me it's been entertaining to read them all.
I think that's what makes Sherlock Holmes great. It's something you can come back to, like the compendium I have. I got that in junior high, and read through the whole thing, and then you read through it again. I mean, the stories are so fascinating, and you can always go back to it because you like to try to solve it yourself. You're looking for the same clues, as you go along, and trying to see if you can beat Holmes to the solution of what he's talking about. But it's always interesting, and America has never given up on this. I mean, look how many movies and how many different Sherlock Holmeses there have been on both television and the big screen, and they keep coming out because he's such a fascinating character, and there's so many layers to him and the stories, and they can be adapted around. I do want to put in a plug for those of you who really are like Sherlock Holmes and would like to do more for the Rosenbach series. It's on YouTube, and it's every week it's Edward Pettit from the Rosenbach Museum, and then he has a guest person with him each week, and he has 4 or 5 different people that rotate, and you don't participate, so you're just listening. So all the episodes are on there, starting with A Study in Scarlet. If you go to YouTube, Rosenbach Museum, Sherlock Holmes, you can start with the first one, and they're up to I don't know if it's the 18th one or not. I forget what number we just had with the one we just read about the woman in the room with that was a really fascinating story too.
Yeah, the yellow face.
Yeah, the yellow face. That I'd forgotten that one entirely. I was so shocked by the ending of that. It was really good. Anyway, they're on there, and you can look them up and just watch them at your convenience. Read the story, and then watch it. But they take like 2 hours to talk about each story. Plus, they have all their Sherlock tales, which they talk about and make different cocktails every week.
I have a question, and this is probably mostly directed to my former students. Is there any one of you who had not read a Sherlock Holmes story before?
Not.
Derek, you're not one of my former students. Okay, I know you like to think of it.
I raised it quiet. I raised my hand quietly.
Yeah, but I always will find out. And that's an interesting question to me, because if you hadn't, what were your expectations? Because now I'm a curmudgeonly old fart, so that I can read, the section on Utah and the Mormons and say, my God, the hell kind of a writer is, obviously this was his first work, highly flawed. Who structures a book like that? Right? I mean, and make all kinds of other judgments. How did you respond to it as a first read? Like, hey, I've never read Sherlock before. I know that, Beth, you found him a little bit of an egotist.
I still enjoyed it though, because what I came in expecting was a smart criminal investigation and maybe a little bit of science and good interactions with Watson, and it delivered on that. Can't complain ultimately when there's a good mystery.
Well, my first Sherlock Holmes story I read was Mr. Talbot's ninth grade English class at GA, where it was the Red-Headed League was in the anthology of short stories when we had our section on short stories, and we that was Mr. Talbot, and that was so we were introduced.
Were you already watching the movies?
No, this is ninth grade. I mean, we didn't start. I don't think Channel 48 existed until probably the mid 60s. And then between the roller derby and the wrestling and the bullfighters from Mexico, and Sherlock Holmes and the Three Stooges and everything else was just part of.
No one quite like Gorilla Monsoon, was there?
That's right.
Gorilla Monsoon.
No.
Chief J. Strongbow and all his
Yeah,
friends.
they were all on that's what Channel 48 was all about. And then they finally got the Flyers, and you started getting the Big Five basketball. You got other things to watch.
So I have 8:15, actually 8:17 on my watch right now, so I don't want to take people over too long. Doc, do you want to set them up for next week for our reading and
Sure.
Agatha coming?
So here's the deal. You only have to read half of The Mysterious Affair at Styles. Now, I'm sure that many of you, like me, will say, well, I'm not going to only read half of it. But here's the thing. You can't give anything away. You can't be spoilers. Okay? And I don't know if I can expel you from this group. But
we can mute you. We can mute you if you start to say something.
Mute you forever. You'll be forever muted. So you read the first and think about
first 7 chapters, right? 1 through 7.
Yes.
Yeah, yes. 1 through 7 you want to read.
And there's no Eagles on Sunday. Wrap it up. There's no Eagles. Just get it done. Let's wrap it up.
Exactly. And here, I'll give you an interesting Agatha Christie thing to think about. Agatha Christie was the first British woman to surf standing up. She went to Australia, took up surfing, and stood up and surfed in on a surfboard. And that's the kind of crazy nut Agatha Christie was as a young person. But first British woman to surf.
Think about how different the novel you're going to read is from Sherlock Holmes. Think about the way there has been this development in crime fiction, as well as how has she incorporated. She even mentions Sherlock Holmes early in the novel, but how much has she incorporated, this sort of the model that he has created?
I'm interested, by the way, to see as I get into these British mysteries. The formula is very Scooby-Doo for me, by the way. The whole book, I'm like, by the end, if it weren't for you damn meddling kids, I would have gotten away with this. Like
Scooby-Doo.
Just
totally
feel like
Scooby-Doo, Derek. It's totally Scooby-Doo. Mystery Machine.
This had a very
Scooby-Doo based
Scooby-Doo.
himself on these mysteries.
That's kind of the formula that I've seen, that I kind of felt in the book, is that Scooby-Doo kind of follows the same thing. But anyway, I'm curious to see what Agatha Christie brings us.
You know, there's probably somebody working on a PhD who is going to take that idea and fly with it as a discipline.
I have a question though.
I'd love to read that.
Did anybody ever watch The Great Mouse Detective?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, long
That's
ago.
like I was thinking of that the whole time I was reading the story.
Well, I mean, you know, it's like those, you know, there are features that are just, you know, embedded in the genre, and they're not gonna, you know, they're gonna continue over time.
Kind of outing myself as an epic nerd, but before the first introduction I had to the story was actually Neil Gaiman's A Study in Emerald, which I don't know if anyone's read that, but it takes the concept of this story and puts it into the Cthulhu mythos. It's fantastic if you like Neil Gaiman and are interested in like horror and all of that. But he has a story, A Study in Emerald, which is a study in Scarlet interpreted through weird mythology. So that's kind of what I was drawing parallels to in my mind as I was reading this, which it breaks down at a certain level because, you know, there are no elder gods in this one, but it still was kind of an interesting, like, and I guess to I guess bring it back to something that makes sense. It shows that how ripe for interpretation the character is, both in either through Scooby-Doo or, you know, just different ways that you can take the base of a character too smart for his own good, his handler / interpreter, and they go out and solve crime. So, but if you like weird, definitely recommend short story A Study in Emerald.
But another thought, I know most of your GA graduates, as were my children and grandchildren, are there now. I'm a GFS graduate, and just thinking back to my 10th grade English teacher, and I don't know if anybody remembers him or knows him. I know you're all GA folks. His name was Richard Tyre, who was the smartest teacher we ever had at GFS. And one of the things that we haven't talked about tonight, we talked about what a bumbling dodo Watson is, but good old Dick Tyre 50 years ago taught us about heroes, and how heroes often have this second person like a Watson that make them look great. And I remember in those days, I was thinking about Zorro. Anyone know Zorro? You know, they had, was it Benito or Bernardo? Remember, who was a deaf mute? Maybe Doc, you remember this? And Jenny, you're not as old as I am. The Lone Ranger.
Tonto.
Of course, yeah.
Right.
Right, a sidekick is always there to sort of
a sidekick, exactly.
Have the hero play off the sidekick.
Right. Superman had Jimmy Olsen. I mean, if you think about it, so it's a great way to look at it, who that second person is that makes the hero look even more brilliant and spectacular.
Well, also to tell their story without bragging, them having to say how great they are. They have somebody to share their story with everybody and sort of say, wow, look how great this person is.
It's funny you said that, Tom. Has anybody here watched the Enola Holmes 2 things on Netflix?
Couple times.
Yeah, so it's funny you said that, Tom, because in a way Sherlock Holmes acts as like a sidekick to his sister in those shows.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I mean, if you I've watched every Hercule Poirot with David Suchet at least 3 times. At least 3 times. So I mean, totally, you know, the Hastings that is his sidekick. He's incredibly likable, but he's pretty dumb. And
by Jerry.
interestingly, he narrates the mysterious affair at Styles. So it's, you know, I guess I'm thinking of him as this buffoon, but then he becomes the narrator, and it's really kind of interesting what the producers of the television series did when compared to the, you know, the reality of the character in the novel.
Yeah, but when he was the villain in Patriot Games, it ruined the whole thing. It ruined the whole thing. You know, it really did. I mean, I can't see him on Hercule anymore without thinking that son of a bee was the one that betrayed Harrison.
I hadn't
Ford.
even thought about that. Now I'm going to have to watch them all again. I think we have to go now. So
I was
that-
going to say we should. We're
All right.
running over here, and I know. Want to sign out. I want to thank you all for being here tonight.
Yes.
It's great. We look forward to seeing you next week to talk about Agatha Christie and the Mysterious Affair at Styles.
Great fun. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you guys.
Yep.
Wonderful first class.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Thank-
Laura. Bye.
Yep, there's
Bye.
Heather.
See you.